Support for Headline Humboldt is made possible in part by viewers like you. Thank you.
Coming up next on Headline Humboldt, the only Cal Poly Humboldt professor who remains suspended following April's protests against the war in Gaza has taken to teaching his classes in the community. Reporter Ryan Hutson will bring us that story. Also, longtime local journalist Jim Hight joins us in studio to talk about his new book, Moon Over Humboldt. Coming up now on Headline Humboldt. From the top of Humboldt Hill, this is Headline Humboldt. I'm James Falk. Thanks for joining us. Illness or injury can occur at any time to anyone, a fact that we all understand deeply as we go about our day-to-day lives. It's a crapshoot. Tripping over a toy, slipping on a wet floor, getting T-boned in an intersection because someone else runs a red light. These are among the millions of possibilities we all face every single day. Add to that illness. Hereditary disease, stress-related aging, arthritis, environmental toxins, COVID-19, heart disease, cancer, and every other thing that can abuse and degrade our immune systems. Each of these health catastrophes brings with it a loss of function, missed work, and a decreasing quality of life. Should it also bring bankruptcy? Both the California State Legislature and the U.S. Congress are now considering new rules to prevent unpaid medical bills from destroying people's credit. Given the astronomical cost of receiving care in this country, it's absolutely shameful that even now, someone who suffers illness or injury without the means of paying for treatment likely suffers the added indignity and social cost of a low credit score. I hope the legislature makes these changes with due haste. In the long run, I think universal health care is the only solution to all the inequities in our medical system. But absent that, let's at least stop adding, almost literally, insult to injury. In a moment, we'll be joined by longtime local journalist Jim Hight, who, while having moved on from the region, has just written a new novel based in Humboldt County. But first, the news. In April, Cal Poly Humboldt erupted in protests against the war in Gaza. These protests led to the occupation of Siemens Hall, among other buildings, and ultimately to an ill-fated decision to violently remove those students. Faculty, as well as students, were ultimately targeted for consequences by the college administration, led by then University President Tom Jackson. One professor, Dr. Ruhollah Aghasala, even now remains suspended from his position, even though the district attorney's office has filed no charges and President Tom Jackson has left his job. Ryan Hutson has the story.
After being arrested at Cal Poly Humboldt with student protesters, Dr. Ruhollah Aghasala has been suspended pending an investigation into the professor's role during the week of protest for Palestine. This, despite the DA dropping all charges against the professor, who was notified of the extended suspension just before the start of school. With the thinly veiled threat of termination still looming, rather than sit by idly, the teacher decided to teach in public.
And this fall, unfortunately, I wasn't able to officially be on the schedule and teach on campus. So I'm using public spaces to sit down and to discuss what we read and what we learned today. This is not about me. This is about well-being of campus and community. Even my little communications with the admin about reinstating me and lifting suspensions was not a self-advocacy. It was more a concern about a well-being and restoring the trust that was disrupted in the spring by the previous administration.
When you say the trust was disrupted, what occurred that led to that?
They engaged with the students' peaceful protest violently. They didn't listen to students' demands, and they escalated and they responded to that forcefully and violently. They did not engage with faculty input. They did not include community input, and they made decisions that were not the best for the community.
For Headline Humboldt, this is Ryan Hutson.
Just returned from an exhausting trip to Chicago, KEET Executive Director David Gordon sat down with me this week to talk about the experience of attending this year's Democratic National Convention. Seeing history unfold before his eyes, his trip may well bode a new wrinkle for how KEET covers national events such as these.
Over the past few days, the television networks keep running the same footage that they have of the convention, and everybody gets the same feed. All of the networks, they're basically running from the same images. But being there and being in the midst of that energy, especially an event of this significance, because that's the reason why I felt I wanted to be there, was to bring back to the folks in this community what it is like, first of all, to be in that environment and not just watching what's prepared and planned out and just see what they want you to see from the feed that everybody gets. But to get a feeling of what it's like to be there with all of these people who are all united in this thing that they're trying to get accomplished, and in this case, the nomination of the first black woman for president of the United States. That's historically significant, and to be present for something like that, I felt was important. I'm glad we were able to be there to record something that maybe is a little bit different from what you've seen from the usual media outlets. When you start to watch it on TV, it's we're already here, everybody's in place, and the program is started, it's following its schedule, and this is what's going to happen. There's a lot that goes into getting to that point, especially for what we were doing. We were not assigned a specific spot. We were assigned a general area for press, and there were a lot of other folks in the same boat as us, where you go up to a certain level and set your stuff up, and then you kind of jockey for position with not only the other journalists that are up there, but also with the audience members, because it was standing room only, and that really meant standing room only. You were there bumping elbows and trying to record over the tops of people's heads and other people's phones and all this kind of thing. But it does give you an idea of what it is like to actually be in the crowd watching this. So I'm glad I had the opportunity to do it, and to prove to myself and for the station that we can do something like this. We can get the credentialing that we need. We can pass the security test that we need to. We have the equipment that we need to be able to do something like this. Will we do it again? Possibly. Would it be something similar to this or something completely different? I don't know, but that we can go out and we can get access to people and places and bring a different side of the story to the people of this community. That was an important test for me, and now I know, yeah, it can be done. So that makes me happy.
We'll be right back after this short break.
I'm David Gordon, Executive Director of KEET TV. And I want to tell you about the free PBS app. And it's not like free for 30 days or a 3-month trial. It's free for as long as you'd like to use it. Watch episodes of PBS shows that have premiered on TV recently, as well as KEET's live broadcast, right in the app, no antenna required. Shows like Frontline, PBS NewsHour, and Washington Week are always free. But you can get even more out of the PBS app by becoming a sustaining member of KEET. $5, $10, $20 a month. Any of those options will qualify you for our most popular member benefit, PBS Passport. Drama, science, nature, there's so much to watch with Passport. But what really matters is your donation now supports the PBS programs that you watch. Thank you.
Joining us now in studio is longtime local journalist Jim Hight and a new author who's just published a book, Moon Over Humboldt. Thanks for coming in.
Yeah, thanks for having me, James.
So it's nice to see you. We've known each other for a while, and I consider you a friend, so thank you for coming in and also reaching out to me. you've been a journalist for a long time in Humboldt County, and you've done work, I think, all over the country in terms of freelance work, sort of. Has fiction always been a dream? Is this the realization of something, a lifelong ambition, or how would you consider that?
Great question. I would say I was intimidated by writing fiction.
Yeah.
I've been a journalist since high school, more or less, and I learned how to do it. And you assemble the facts, you do your research, you write for the specifications of whatever publication it is, and you get it in on deadline. Writing a book is a whole other universe,
yeah.
And it was years before anybody read what I wrote. So I think it took me. I had to work up my courage to do it, basically.
Yeah. How long did it take you to write the book? How long were you working on it?
About 10 years.
10 years?
Yeah.
Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah. The next one will be quicker.
Well, you'll have the template at least, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, 10 years has to be a passion project. You have to be committed to 10 years.
Yes.
I mean, after now having gone through that process, let's compare the two processes. I mean, what can you do in fiction that you have a hard time or people have a hard time doing in nonfiction or vice versa? Is there a difference like that?
Well, in nonfiction journalism, you interview people, you research stuff, and that drives the story. You come up with a good angle on it, a snappy lead, and there you go. But fiction it's wide open, right? I invented these characters every day when I sat down. I didn't know what was going to happen. It was a mystery and a often very frustrating, but often just a great source of joy to just watch what happened. And when I say that, I wrote this book. I'm not an imposter, but it also, I do believe in something like the muse.
Yeah, absolutely.
That shows up when I put in the work to sit there, and not every day, not every hour, but often enough to get this done.
Yeah, I mean, people often talk about the process of fiction as a revealing rather than a creation. Like, it's almost as if the spirit of the project already exists and helps you to kind of uncover it. That kind of alchemical thing is part of, I think, the creative process for a lot of folks anyway.
I like that way of looking at it.
Yeah. So we can get the viewers involved in the conversation a little bit. Can you give us sort of a brief synopsis of what the story is, and then also what are the important elements that people should know about?
Okay, great. Well, there's a synopsis on the back of the cover of the book, which I won't cheat by reading, but there's two main characters. Bill is a middle-aged logger who grew up very traditional and raised his son Kenny very traditionally to work hard, and then Kenny became a meth addict, and Bill's world is shattered, and he has to cope with that terrible pain of seeing his son lost to addiction. Yeah. And Jonah is a young environmentalist who suffers from addiction himself to cannabis and alcohol, and has a family background of alcoholism, very severe. And they meet in a 12-step program, and they hit it off, as people do in those programs. They find in each other someone who they feel drawn to, someone who could help them, but they, of course, have to navigate this tremendous conflict between them over clear-cut logging, basically.
Yeah. It's interesting. I mean, people know I'm in recovery, and I can attest to the fact that your depiction of the rooms is very accurate, especially the sort of support and getting hugs from strange men that may seem uncomfortable at first, but then you're falling into them because they actually feel really good. All of that stuff really resonated for me, and I thought I noticed the familiarity on your part. Go ahead and ask, are you in recovery?
Yes, I'm open about that. I'm a recovering cannabis addict and alcoholic, and yes, people can get addicted to cannabis.
Yes.
I did, and other people do. I'm coming up on 24 years of being clean and sober.
Well, congratulations.
And thank you. And I don't claim affiliation with any particular fellowship, because that would violate the spirit of anonymity, so I'm just refer to myself as being a member of 12-step programs. And I will say that, you ask how this shows up in the book. One aspect that I'm getting a lot of positive feedback about is, in particular, the family recovery aspect.
Yes,
Bill
absolutely.
goes to Alanon, and because his son's an addict, and other people, and I show Alanon meetings and I show Alanon recovery, and that's not as well known as as recovering from your own addiction. So I'm getting a lot of feedback from people who have family members who are addicts that it's heartwarming and moving to see it in fiction, see what they've gone through portrayed in this novel.
Yeah, I think that's a missed thing in these processes where people are trying to get their family members into recovery because maybe they're suffering from some sort of chemical addiction, and they are often like, well, I don't have the problem, they have the problem. But a lot of times the patterns and behaviors that lead to addiction are systemic, and they involve the whole bevy of relationships. It's not just the addict who is suffering from a malaise, it's everybody, and Alanon is a process by which family members can get the same kind of support and love that people who are addicted get in the 12-step programs. And
exactly.
It's virtually identical in principles. So
the 12 steps are virtually the same,
and that's great because then you're also better able to empathize with the person in your family who may be suffering, and I think it just helps build all kinds of cohesion. You mentioned the marijuana thing, and I was just going to say something to that point, that people say, well, it's not chemically addictive like heroin, so it's interesting that you talk about marijuana addiction. Well, before I got addicted to heroin, I was addicted to marijuana, to the point where if I didn't have any, I was going through the carpet looking for little bits of weed that I could smoke because I needed it. It's not necessarily maybe 2 weeks of withdrawals with diarrhea and everything else, but I was panicked, I couldn't relax, I couldn't sleep, and it's a very serious thing, just like anything else. And so people need to be aware of that, especially in a community where cannabis is such a high-profile presence.
I would say it's more psychological and emotional and less physical dependence. But I did similar things to you, looking in the carpet, looking in the back of the drawers. I know there's some weed here somewhere.
Yeah, exactly.
And I'll also mention that in the old days, before cannabis was legal, it was Arcata, where I lived, was a difficult place to recover because you smelled it all the time. You could procure it on the plaza or elsewhere, and the grow houses proliferated, so it was always in the air, so to speak.
And I'm sure it's still hard there. There's still a lot of it there, I'm sure. Now, one of the things that I enjoyed about your book is all the local references. There are personalities that you encounter during the course of the book that are people that I think are recognizable. Some are in honor of, some are just sort of like they're pillars in the community, so it's a natural fit. Is there a risk to that at all, do you feel like, or did you choose to use those characters as not necessarily central to the conflict, so maybe the risk wasn't as high? What are your thoughts on that?
Good question. All right, there's a little two-sentence paragraph in the front of the book that says everything is fiction. Any resemblance to real people living or deceased is purely coincidental, and that's not quite true in all cases. And I'll just be upfront. I created a character that's based largely on Eric Hollenbeck from Blue Ox, where I was a volunteer for years and where I witnessed his incredible ability to mentor and inspire troubled young people. And that aspect is in the book. And I would say to any detractors out there, which I'm sure there aren't any, but how could I write a novel about Humboldt County without mentioning Blue Ox?
Exactly right. I mean, especially now with the Discovery Channel show and everything else. It's high-profile stuff.
Yeah, he's an amazing guy, and so is his wife, Viviana, and the program they've created and the way they labor on year after year to give this community what they give.
Yeah, and it's touching in the book because it is at the what's the name of it in the book? It's not...
the Draft Horse.
Yeah, the Draft Horse Millworks. One of the most important or touching scenes between one of the characters and his son, Kenny, is at the Millworks. And I think that is something that, reaching kids like that is a specialty of his and his wife's, and I think that's important to credit. But that sort of gets at one of the other main themes in the book, or at least it seems to me, the ongoing social struggle that may have been more prevalent in the past, but between environmentalists and loggers. That's one of the meta-narratives that have defined Humboldt County for a long time. I moved here in 1988, so I was right in the middle of the Redwood Summer, and environmentalists, some of them, only a few of them, were spiking trees, and there was a lot of issues going on, a lot of protests, and a lot of anger from both sides. Talk a little bit about how you use that dynamic as fuel for the story, and how that helped drive your narrative.
Good question. 88, yeah. You've been here a long time. I came in 96, and I started writing for the North Coast Journal, and of course the whole controversy about the Headwaters Grove was full on. I went to demonstrations, I interviewed people on all sides, and I found that there was really a lot of interesting backstory to why the loggers are so concerned about, being able to cut down these trees, and why the environmentalists are so opposed to it. Not just the ecological impacts, but the cultural stuff.
Absolutely.
People just don't like clear cutting. I don't like it. I think probably a lot of loggers don't like to look at it, but as the logger in the book says, it grows back. The trees grow back, and that's actually, they think that, they argue that in this coastal climate it's the most efficient way to grow trees and produce lumber. And if they stop doing that, there would be a lot of unintended negative impacts, like importing more lumber from countries that don't, or states and countries that don't have the same forest practice rules that California has. But again, I don't take a position on clear cutting, right? I try to give a full exposition of both people with the opposing perspectives.
Well, and that's the one thing I also enjoyed about what I've read so far in your book, is that both sides are well informed, but they are also learning from the other side. Since these two people come together and they're it's a collision of worldviews. They're initially both of them resistant to even being in proximity, but then they both kind of walk away from their exchanges being like, well, that's interesting, they're more complex than I thought. They're not as stereotyped as I'd imagined, and that's a learning process. And I think that speaks also to the power of the rooms of recovery, right? Like, you have these folks who are from every station in Humboldt County and everywhere, and they come together for a purpose, and through that purpose realize their kind of collective humanity, and it builds bridges.
It does. And right now I'm sure there's plenty of meetings where you have Kamala supporters and Trump supporters, and they're somehow making it work, focusing on what's really important, their collective recovery and moving forward together, at least in recovery.
Now, there was a conversation in the book about the moon over Humboldt, and it's sort of around a dialogue that happens often in 12-step rooms about the notion of a higher power. Some folks don't want to go to 12-step programs because I don't believe in God, and that would be alien to me, and I feel like I'd be sacrificing some principle. But the way you handle it, and the way that I think it's handled in the rooms, is kind of not known generally in the community. But how would you say that is, how to think about that in a way if you're not comfortable with God?
That's a great question. And both of the main characters represent some aspect of my struggle, because I came into 12-step work as an atheist, and or at least an agnostic, and here I'm asked to read and believe passages that use the word God, and turn my will and life over to the care of God. Whew. That was a tough one, but it does say God as we understood him, or some fellowships have changed it to God as we understood God. So, and then you have to, if you're looking for recovery and you're an atheist or an agnostic, and you want to do the 12-step programs, I think really have to look for resources. Other people in there who are also agnostics, and they're there.
Absolutely.
And there's parts of the literature that are very sympathetic to people that aren't, Christian or Jewish or Muslim, that don't believe in a supreme being. And I mention those in the book, and I show both the old logger and the young environmentalist going through similar struggles. The moon plays a role in that, but I won't say anything more about that to avoid spoilers.
It's interesting. I think that the important point about the higher power, for what I've experienced with the 12-step programs, is not that even that there is a higher power, but that you're not the higher power. You have to relinquish what you think is your control, because it's that sense of control and wanting control that is often at the heart of people's struggles with addiction. And addiction is a way to maintain the illusion of control, but then ultimately it leads to chaos, obviously.
You're right. You can't. I had to acknowledge that this addiction is stronger than me. I tried for years to get off it without 12-step. And I relapsed dozens of times before I got consistent sobriety.
One of the other issues that I really liked, and we talked a little bit about it in Addicts Among Us, which is the documentary we produced about my experience and others with heroin addiction, is the idea that there's trauma that is involved, and that often it's our family experiences that lead us either into addiction or into that realm. And I think that, again, like with the Alanon question, that's important for people to realize that the family can be the source of healing, but it can also be the source of the symptomology, or whatever you want to call it. And we all need to be included in those conversations and in that healing if we're really going to make a difference in people's lives. Right?
Yeah, it's not, and both characters, all the characters who are in recovery have, in my book, have trauma or adverse childhood experiences behind them, or they grew up with addicted parents and relatives, and we all came by it honestly, so to speak.
Yeah. So now locally, where can people buy your book, and is there a national retailer that people can go to?
Yes. Northtown Books in Arcata and Eureka Books in Eureka, and if you know of another independent bookstore anywhere, go in and ask for it. I'm a big believer in supporting independent bookstores, especially as I've learned more about how tight the publishing business model is. And you can get it on Amazon and Barnes & Noble.
Okay. And are you going to be doing any readings or anything now that you're in town?
Yes, I've got 2 today. 4 p.m. at the McKinleyville Library, 6:30 p.m. at Northtown Books, and tomorrow 5:30 to 8:30 at Eureka Books, although it won't be a reading, I'll just be there to informally talk about the book.
And now we've got a minute left, you've since relocated to Colorado, but what do you miss most about Humboldt County?
Gosh, the natural beauty. We got to visit Crab Park, my wife and I, and we were just on the waterfront today, and then the people, frankly. People like you.
Well, I appreciate that, sir. Thank you, Jim. And thanks for coming in and for joining us. And I loved your book. I'll finish it, unfortunately, after the interview. But, thank you.
You're welcome.
It's really well done. People should check it out. That's it for this week. Remember to check out our podcast, Neon Galactic, and on YouTube and wherever else you get your podcasts for conversations deep and wide, spanning everything from philosophy and science to mysticism and magic. This is your source for those conversations. Stay tuned, stay informed.